Okay, well, I think everybody knows who Dr. Cohn is, so I'm just going to let him begin. Dr. Cohn.
For the opportunity to talk, I'm going to speak about the work being done by our Crystal Award winner today, Bud Frazier, who is in the back of the room. Crystal Hart. Okay. This is work that he and I have been involved in for the last 14 years, and it's been probably the most exciting episode of my professional career. Here, let me take this off. I love talking about it, and any opportunity I have to have a captured audience and talk about it, I seize. It's the past, present, and future of the total artificial heart, and I think it'll give us a glimpse at what's going to be the first practical artificial heart in the world. I have to make this disclosure. 9 months ago, I took a job with Johnson & Johnson. I'm now a full-time Johnson & Johnson employee, but I'm still clinically involved by their graciousness. They've allowed me to stay at the Texas Heart Institute and continue to do cases. But this technology I'm going to describe has no connection with Johnson & Johnson. They don't have a financial investment or any other emotional investment in it yet. Okay, good. Did you really? Yeah, so right when Joe bought stock, it went up. I don't know if it's cause and effect.
I bought the stock when I heard he left.
Okay. Anyway, I think everybody in this room knows that heart failure is a big deal. Probably affects everybody in this room in some way indirectly, hopefully. And the ultimate manifestation of heart failure is death. There are about 500,000, 400,000 to 500,000 people that die every year of heart failure. Yet we can only transplant a few thousand. Last year there was 3,100, the busiest transplant year in the United States history, but it's still about 1 in 170 cases that are going to die of heart failure. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had an artificial heart? That's not a new idea. People have been working on it forever. In fact, Michael DeBakey brought this brilliant Argentinian scientist Domingo Loyola in. He stole him from the Cleveland Clinic. They developed something that looked like it perhaps showed promise. And tragically, while he was out of town, his then protege, Denton Cooley, implanted it in a patient while he was in Washington, D.C. getting funding. That went over very well. The two of them started a fairly bitter rivalry that continued over the next 40 years and was portrayed in the lay press. The device is still here with us today, although that patient tragically only lived 64 days and ultimately died after getting a heart transplant. The device has continued to evolve, and it's now called the Syncardia. You just saw it featured in a presentation. It uses compressed air delivered in and out through hoses through the body wall to move bladders to pump blood. 4 mechanical valves turn it into unidirectional flow for the left and right pumps. And the device has been very successful in the right kind of patients, but as you just heard, it's associated with a higher incidence of renal failure, and if you have a mechanical problem, it's catastrophic. It glides about like a helicopter. And you have to have this box outside the body. This is what delivers the compressed air. It has to be replaced every 60 days. You may have just heard in the media last year, a patient in Detroit who was transplanted after 555 days. He went through 11 different boxes. Plus, you have the hose through the body, which is not ideal. But more importantly, this device that sits in the chest, the actual heart, has an unknown lifespan. That's why most of the patients have the device in place for about 60 days. That said, there is now one patient who's had that device in place for 5 years. We had a patient at 4 years until his device catastrophically failed in the middle of the night and he died. So it is a very valuable technology for patients facing imminent death who are transplant candidates to keep them alive until transplant can be identified. But we really need a permanent heart replacement device. People have been shooting at that goal for decades as well. In fact, some of you may know the AbioCor total artificial heart implanted in 2001 and 2002. Dr. Frazier, our honoree, was intimately involved in that program, did all the animal testing at the Texas Heart Institute, and after about 150 animals, they implanted it in 14 patients. The longest surviving of those 14 went 15 months before his device failed, and he said, no, I don't want anything done. I'd rather just die. But Several of the patients died before 9 months, and you can see the causes there. So it was a brilliant, brilliant device, but tragically flawed. Just like engineering and scientists have never made an airplane with flapping wings, it's probably prohibitively difficult to make an artificial heart that beats like your own native heart. The device was too big, it consumed too much power, 38 watts. It didn't adjust the left and right side of the circulation quite as well as it needed to be able to do. And then most importantly, the psychic durability, it would fail. And so in 2004, after spending $250 million, Abiomed was gone. Abiomed gave up. Well, there's another artificial heart that's now in production or attempting to be. They've already run through $120 million. This is a European group led by Carpentier. Again, a very complex, albeit very brilliant device, but it's large. They've implanted 5 patients in the last year and a half, 2 years. The longest survivor went about 8.5 months before his device broke. And so they then were put on pause. They've just received notification that they can do some more humans. I wish them luck. It's a brilliant device. But right now, their prospects don't look great to me. So what is the future of the artificial heart? Well, let's look at what happened with VADs. We went from the big pulsatile devices that would last 18 months to the continuous flowing, rapidly spinning devices that you just heard beautifully described. These things are much smaller. By the way, the first one of these was implanted at the Texas Heart Institute in November of 2003 by Bud Frazier and Igor Grigorik. They're much, much smaller, which is a great thing, but they're easier to implant, they're quieter, they use a lot less energy, and most importantly, they're more durable. There are now over 100 patients that have had a single HeartMate 2 in place for 10 years or more. So rapidly spinning things on bearings, or now without bearings, like in the HeartMate 3, or hydrodynamically levitated like the HeartWare, have the potential to be much more durable. And as a result of that, now the LVAD space is blowing up. You saw some of the new technology that's coming out. Bud Frazier simply said, hey, really, why don't we leverage the advantages of the small? No, he speaks much clearer than that. He said we could use these little pumps to reinvent the artificial heart. And so Rob Jarvik graciously gave us some of his Jarvik turbines, and this was our very first effort at that. We cut out the heart of a cow. We put one pump in the left atrium and hooked it to the aorta, a second pump in the right atrium and hooked it to the pulmonary artery, and put flow probes on, and there's that animal in the postoperative period. His heart has 2 moving parts. He has no pulse or heartbeat. You can see the pulmonary artery and the aorta filling with contrast, and there he is, not overly concerned by the fact he has no heartbeat, no pulse, no EKG. We wanted to do this over and over again based on this initial success, but it was difficult to get the Jarvik turbines. Luckily, we had Micromed in town with us, DeBakey's company, and we could get these very readily, and they were very excited about this endeavor. The challenge was these weren't well suited to put in the atria like we did for the Jarvik turbines, so we used the MacGyver technique. How many of you guys know MacGyver? Had a goofy haircut. He could repurpose things that were readily available in his environment to defeat terrorists and fight crime. If you understand MacGyver and the MacGyvering process, I think you'll all agree this is medical device prototyping headquarters. Using stuff from Home Depot, specifically drywall tape and fiberglass and fabric from the fabric store, we built up these piñata-like structures that were flexible. You could cut them in the operating room. You could sew through them. The holes wouldn't leak. And on the inside, it was a beautiful sheet of Dacron, something we all knew was okay to put in the bloodstream. And we made a couple of these. One of them we sewed to the right atrial appendage and put a Micromed turbine on there. The second one we sewed, not appendage, I'm sorry, we cut out the whole heart. So it's the back rim like you sew to for a heart transplant, the left atrial remnant, I should say. There's one of those cuffs going to the left atrial remnant. You can see they have pressure hoses coming off of them so we can monitor the left and right atrial pressure. There are the 2 turbines. We cross them just like Mother Nature does. You can see how much smaller this device is than the Abiacore. And only 2 moving parts, not 600. No flexible components, no valves. And there's that cow 7 weeks later, walking on a treadmill, eating molasses off of Bud Frazier's hand while Denton Cooley looks on. That was cornuto, which means horny one because of the horns from his head. After 68 cases, we were pretty compelled that this had merit, that this technique could get traction. And we thought maybe we could try this on a patient. It's very simple. We'd cut the heart out like doing a transplant. We'd sew the thing on. We had 3 of the animals went to the whole 90-day period. It's difficult with animals because they're lying in a stanchion and they don't cooperate. We thought the results would be better with patients perhaps. 8 of them were able to get on the treadmill like you just saw. They'd have cardiac outputs of 8 to 11 liters, and it used very little power, 15 watts all in for both turbines. But we had to have 2 controllers, one to control the left and one to control the right. And since we'd removed the cow's native heart, it was imperative that the device does not have interrupted power. Still, we thought it had merit. We had some problems with clot on the right from the veins that would get lodged in the inlet, but still, we thought it had merit. It was smaller, it used less power, it should be more durable, and maybe it was worth trying out clinically. That said, we knew if we sewed drywall tape and bath and tile silicone from Home Depot into a patient, there'd probably be very difficult discussions had after that. So we looked on the aisles and the shelves in the Texas Heart Institute and found materials not unlike those that were available at Home Depot, specifically hernia mesh. Instead of $6.99 for a 50-foot roll, it's $1,800 a sheet. The Dacron cardiovascular patches made to sew in the heart, instead of $9 for a square yard, it's about $1,000. And then medical silicone, and cobbled together what we think was the first continuous flow artificial heart out of 2 HeartMate 2s, which had been approved at that point, and so we could use them without violating any trial. We then waited. A gentleman came in, had cardiac amyloidosis, had it in his liver, in his kidneys, and ultimately we found out in his lungs. He was on dialysis and profound liver failure and being supported by the tandem heart. We had nothing to offer him. He wasn't a transplant candidate. At that point, that was a contraindication of the syncardia. So we sewed in our device. He'd been in a cardiac coma for over a week. Here he is. He woke up. He got extubated. He was an engineer. His family said he would be interested in doing anything, even if just to advance science. We thought after this, we could perhaps get him a bone marrow transplant and then maybe do a 3-organ transplant on him. But we found amyloid in his lungs, and as his liver function continued to deteriorate, after about 5.5 weeks, he couldn't remain wakefulness, and after some very challenging discussions, we terminated care. Got a lot of great scientific articles out of it. Bud and I got to do a TED Talk. We were in National Geographic on the cover of Popular Science, which I subscribed to when I was a kid, so that was personally very meaningful. But probably the most important thing that came out of this is we met this gentleman, Daniel Timms, who had a concept for a continuous flow artificial heart that addressed some of the challenges I just outlined, specifically clot on the right and the need for 2 controllers. This was his device that he conceived of. 1 moving part suspended in a magnetic field and able to micro-shift its position 2,000 times a second. Actually, the electromagnets that keep it floating adjust 20,000 times a second, but by shifting, it could change the relative efficiencies of the left and right pump, and does it every time the animal inhales or exhales or defecates. It's an amazing, amazing device, and because of his passion, he's able to recruit an amazing team of brilliant PhDs. Now, the device didn't look like that when we met him 5 years ago. It looks like that now, and one of the ways it's gotten there is by leveraging 3D printing. 3D printing is increasingly becoming a part of our world and enables us to take the computer file that is the device, print parts, and assemble them, and do that on almost a daily basis until we get it right. So to iterate our technology, to try new variations in the impellers was super, super easy. Ultimately, we thought we had it right. Here is a plastic printed heart. You can see how much smaller it is than the AbioCor, and again, only 1 moving part now, 1 controller, and the ability to balance the left and right circulation, and it does it autonomously without any user input. The device functioned brilliantly from a hemolysis perspective, and that's a result of the iterative process. We had a flow loop where we could characterize performance, and then people started saying, well, this is fine and good, but it doesn't make a pulse. Do we need a pulse? Is there anyone in here that doesn't have a pulse? Yeah, you? No? All right, yeah, a couple. Well, we know that flow is continuous at the capillary level, so none of you have a pulse in your capillaries, and that's where all the gas exchange and endocrine functions and nutrients and waste products are exchanged. In all of our 70 animals we did with no pulse, they all did fine. But if you have a blockage in an artery, the washout behind it may not be as good without a pulse, so maybe that's a good thing. This whole episode of gastrointestinal hemorrhage, is that somehow related to a pulse? Well, when you bring the pulse back, it seems to go away. Is that a function of some of the blood bypassing the pump, or is that something that continuous flow does? Nobody can say for sure. And it'll certainly improve washout of the pump if we have pulsatility. So maybe making a pulse is of merit. Well, this is a digital pump. If we want a pulse, we can make any pulse you want by figuring out what speed algorithm. And now, if you have a cardiac output of 5 liters a minute, the instantaneous flow across your aortic valve is probably about 18 liters, and of course, none during diastole when it's closed. Well, this device can go up to 23 liters, so we thought we should be able to make a pretty credible pulse. And so here you can see this plastic heart rocking on a stand, and I think you can see Daniel's thumb and finger being plied apart by the pulsations. So we took this device, again, sewed it to the right atrium and the PA and the left atrium and the aorta, put flow probes on, and there's that animal with a plastic printed heart with one moving part. Here's his bedside monitor showing a very convincing arterial pulsation. And the characteristics of this pulse are very similar to what you see in the native circulation. So at this point, we thought we had it. It could do 10 liters easily with a pulse. It balanced the left and right circulation, pulmonary and systemic. There was no mechanical wear, no bearings. That one moving part was floating. And we could have a shunt to protect emboli. Let me show you what that means. So there's a shunt across at the outflow level. So about 1 liter per minute is flowing from the aorta to the pulmonary artery, which means if we wash a clot into this on purpose, and we've done that, it'll get batted around by the right rotors. Look at the right rotors. They sort of look like the paddle wheel on a riverboat. That's no mistake. They make them like that so branches and things won't get caught. Well, clot can't get caught in there either, and it can't get into that critical gap around the rotor because of the shunt. And so with that, we decided we had it. So we printed it out of metal. This is SLS, selective laser sintering. You take titanium dust. It uses the same computer file that we use in our 3D printer to guide a laser, and the laser is melting the titanium dust together. We then put another layer of dust, spend some more time melting. It does that all night long. The next morning, we put on respiratory filters, because you can't inhale this stuff, and there's our titanium heart arising like Venus from the mist. Here we are putting it in. There's Rich Wampler standing there, one of the pioneers in continuous flow. And there's a device in place. It's very easy to sew in. I show you this slide to just show you the amazing team and resources Dr. Frazier and I have amassed at the Texas Heart Institute. It takes an army to do this kind of work, and we've got one. And there's one of the animals with the bivacor heart walking on a treadmill. It went from 10.5 to 12 liters with just walking without us touching controls. Then we put an autonomous speed control that every 2 seconds tries to increase the speed. When the magnetic bearing detects a suction event, it goes down and then starts trying to climb again. With that, it went from 10 liters to 15.5 liters with the cow walking. Here's the device now, half as big as a can of Coke, one moving part, no valves, no mechanical wear, super easy to put in. Here's one of the devices in place, by the way, using Syncardia cuffs. They were generous in loaning us those. We now make our own cuffs. Here's the animal, again, went from 11 liters to 14.5 liters. And more importantly, he put on 72 pounds of lean muscle mass during the 96 days he had this. It was a 90-day study. He got a 6-day reprieve from the governor because the pathologist was out of town. But I think that's the right flyer at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. That's a cow with a completely artificial heart, smaller than a heart failure heart, with one moving part that'll never fail. There's no mechanical wear, no flexible components to get brittle and break, with a cardiac output of 14 liters a minute, which would probably be enough for anybody in here. And if we diminish the pulse, we can get up to 23 liters. The hemodynamics were pristine throughout the procedure. All the laboratory values were normal. Hemolysis was negligible. And when we sacked this animal at 96 days, you could have run this thing under tap water and sewn it immediately into another animal. We've designed frozen, the part that goes in the chest. We have a couple more things to do in the microprocessor that drives it. But summarizing from this body of work that I've been so privileged to be involved in, I think these continuous flow pumps are well suited for making the next generation total artificial heart and the first practical permanent implant. If you want a pulse, you can make one. They're smaller, they use less power, and they're much more durable. And I'll go on record as saying the first practical mechanical replacement for the failing human heart will be continuous flow. Thank you very much.
Have a seat. Here you go.